Here, every week, it feels like someone comes up and tells me they remember when I was only this tall. I've been blessed with an amazing father, so this year, I'm giving him the best gift I could think of by getting up here and giving him the week off.
The room was silent. Not the usual silence before a sermon, a different silence, the kind that appears when people sense something is changing, but can't yet explain why. Jonathan Osteen stood before the congregation. His father had spent decades building one of the most influential churches in the world. Now, for the first time, some people believed Jonathan was beginning to carve a very different path. Was he simply finding his own voice, or was he questioning the foundation of a ministry watched by millions? Because if that was true, the consequences could reach far beyond one family. And what happened next would leave people asking a question that still hasn't gone away. See this with your own eyes. Drop where you're watching from below and stick around with us. There's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's continue. For most of his life, Jonathan Osteen was known for one thing: his last name. Wherever he went, people already had expectations, not because of what he had done, but because of who his father was. And for a long time, Jonathan seemed comfortable carrying that weight. He appeared on church platforms, spoke at events, and gradually became a familiar face to the millions who followed Lakewood Church. But as the years passed, something began to shift. People started paying closer attention to what Jonathan was actually saying, not Joel. Jonathan. The differences were subtle at first, easy to miss. While Joel Osteen became known for messages centered on hope, encouragement, and overcoming obstacles, some listeners noticed Jonathan spending more time discussing sacrifice, service, purpose, and spiritual struggle. The contrast wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable, and in a church watched by millions, noticeable can become important very quickly. Then came a sermon that sparked conversation, not because it was angry, not because it was rebellious, but because it raised questions. Questions about faith, questions about success, questions about what Christianity should focus on in a world obsessed with achievement. Within hours, clips began spreading online. Viewers debated every word. Supporters praised Jonathan for bringing a fresh perspective. Critics wondered if he was moving away from the message that helped build Lakewood into a global ministry. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer about one sermon. It was about direction. And that's when another question began to emerge, a much bigger question. If Jonathan's voice continued growing stronger, what would that mean for the future of Lakewood Church? Nobody had an answer yet. But somewhere inside that growing debate was the beginning of a much larger conflict, and the next issue would turn a simple discussion into something far more controversial. At first, many people thought the discussion was about Jonathan Osteen. It wasn't. Not really. Beneath the headlines and online arguments was a much older debate, one that had existed for decades, a debate about what faith should look like. And suddenly, Jonathan found himself standing right in the middle of it. Lakewood Church became famous for a message of hope, a message that encouraged people to believe for better days ahead. For millions of supporters, that message changed lives. It gave people strength during difficult times. It helped them keep moving forward when life felt impossible. But critics have long argued that modern Christianity sometimes places too much attention on success, comfort, and visible blessings. They point to stories in the Bible filled with hardship, sacrifice, persecution, waiting, endurance. Two very different views, both claiming to point toward the same truth. And now some viewers believed Jonathan's preaching was touching that sensitive fault line, not because he openly attacked anyone, but because he seemed willing to ask questions many people preferred to avoid. Questions about suffering, questions about purpose, questions about whether faith should still remain strong when blessings don't come. The reaction was immediate. Supporters saw courage. Critics saw danger. Comment sections became battlefields. Social media clips spread faster than ever. The conversation was no longer confined to a church building in Houston. It had become part of a much larger national discussion. And as the debate grew louder, another reality started becoming impossible to ignore. Jonathan wasn't just another preacher with an opinion. He was the son of Joel Osteen, which meant every question he asked carried a different kind of weight. And that weight would soon lead people to an even bigger question, a question that could change everything about Lakewood's future. Who would eventually lead Lakewood Church when Joel Osteen stepped aside? Long before any controversy began, many people were already asking a different question, a question that hovered quietly in the background. Who would eventually lead Lakewood Church? The church's story is deeply connected to family. It began with Joel Osteen's father, John Osteen, who founded the ministry decades ago. Then came Joel, a man who transformed a local church into a global platform, reaching millions through television, streaming, books, and social media. For years, many observers naturally looked toward Jonathan, not because anyone officially named him as a successor, but because succession is one of the biggest questions facing any large ministry. And Lakewood is no ordinary church. It is one of the largest churches in America. Thousands fill the building every week. Millions more watch from around the world. Whoever leads next won't simply inherit a pulpit. They'll inherit a global audience, a global brand, a global legacy. And that's where things become complicated, because succession isn't just about leadership, it's about vision. What happens if the next generation sees things differently? What happens if they want to emphasize different priorities, different conversations, different challenges? The more Jonathan's public voice developed, the more those questions began surfacing. Not because he announced some grand plan, but because people started comparing styles, comparing messages, comparing perspectives. Some saw continuation, others saw contrast. And once people start comparing a father and son, the speculation becomes impossible to stop. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't only about sermons anymore. It was about the future of Lakewood, the future of its message, and the future of a young preacher trying to build an identity beyond one of the most famous last names in modern Christianity. But if leadership questions were creating pressure in public, an even greater challenge was quietly growing behind the scenes, because carrying a famous name can be both a blessing and a burden. And that burden was about to become impossible to ignore. From the outside, being Joel Osteen's son might seem simple, a built-in platform, a ready-made audience, a future already waiting. But reality is rarely that easy, because every time Jonathan Osteen steps onto a stage, he carries more than a microphone. He carries expectations. The expectations of a church, a family, and millions of people who already have an idea of who they think he should become. For many pastors' children, that pressure is familiar. The world watches every decision, every sermon, every word, every difference. And the larger the ministry, the greater the scrutiny becomes. Some people wanted Jonathan to sound exactly like his father. Others wanted him to be completely different. The problem was that both groups were watching closely, waiting, analyzing, comparing, and comparisons can become a burden of their own. As discussions about his preaching grew online, another challenge quietly emerged: identity. Was Jonathan simply continuing a family legacy, or was he trying to establish his own voice? The question sounds simple, but for someone raised inside one of the most influential churches in America, it can become deeply personal. Every sermon suddenly means more. Every statement carries extra weight. Every difference becomes a headline. And as public interest intensified, the conversation expanded beyond theology. People began focusing on relationships, family dynamics, expectations, the emotional cost of standing apart from those closest to you. Whether those tensions were real or exaggerated by public speculation, one thing became clear: the spotlight was getting brighter, and brighter spotlights create larger shadows. Because while Jonathan was facing pressure from public expectations, Lakewood Church itself was about to face a challenge no modern ministry can fully control: the power of the internet. And once that machine started moving, the conversation would reach far beyond Houston. There was a time when a sermon ended inside the church walls. Not anymore. Today, a single clip can travel the world in minutes. And once that happens, the story no longer belongs to the people in the room. It belongs to everyone. Lakewood Church knows that reality better than most. For decades, the ministry has built one of the largest audiences in modern Christianity. Thousands gather in person, millions watch online. Every sermon is recorded, every message is shared, every word can become a headline. And that's exactly what began happening. As discussions around Jonathan Osteen grew, social media did what social media always does. It amplified everything. Supporters clipped moments they found inspiring. Critics clipped moments they found concerning. The same sermon suddenly produced two completely different stories, depending on who was watching. Comment sections exploded, debates spread across platforms, videos generated millions of views, and with every new discussion, more people became aware of a question they had never considered before. Could the next generation of Lakewood look different from the current one? That question alone was enough to fuel endless speculation, because large ministries don't just lead congregations, they represent ideas, traditions, identities. And whenever people think those identities might be changing, reactions become emotional very quickly. The pressure continued building, not necessarily because of what was happening inside Lakewood, but because of what people believed might be happening. Sometimes perception creates as much tension as reality, and in this case, perception was spreading faster than facts. Soon, the conversation wasn't just about Jonathan. It wasn't even just about Lakewood. It was about something much larger, a collision between legacy and change. And every growing debate was pushing the story toward a moment that seemed impossible to avoid, a moment where difficult choices would have to be made. Every major story eventually reaches a crossroads, a moment where questions can no longer be avoided. For Jonathan Osteen, that moment wasn't necessarily about one sermon, or one comment, or one viral clip. It was about what all those moments seemed to represent when viewed together. By now, people had chosen sides. Some believed Jonathan was simply growing into his own identity. Others believed his message signaled a deeper shift, a shift that could eventually reshape the future of Lakewood Church itself. The tension wasn't really about personalities anymore. It was about vision. Two difficult questions stood at the center of the debate. Should a ministry protect the message that built its success, or should the next generation be free to challenge old assumptions? Neither answer was simple, and that's what made the situation so powerful, because both sides believed they were protecting something valuable. One side focused on preserving a legacy that had inspired millions. The other focused on the possibility that every generation must ask new questions. Legacy versus evolution, continuity versus change, comfort versus conviction. As the discussion intensified, observers began wondering whether these two paths could continue side by side, or whether they would eventually collide. History offered plenty of examples. Many influential ministries have faced similar moments. A founder builds something extraordinary. Then the next generation inherits both the opportunities and the expectations. Sometimes the transition is seamless. Sometimes it changes everything. And suddenly, the biggest question wasn't whether Jonathan created controversy. It was whether he was standing at the beginning of a completely different chapter, a chapter that could redefine his future, and perhaps even the future of Lakewood Church itself. Because once a person begins finding their own voice, there is usually no going back. And what happened next may have been the most important turning point of all. The strange thing about expectations is that they often create the very thing they are trying to prevent. The more people compared Jonathan Osteen to his father, the more they searched for differences. The more they searched for differences, the more those differences seemed to grow. And before long, the conversation became bigger than either man. Because this was never just about a church. It was about identity, about what happens when someone born into a legacy begins asking their own questions. History is filled with stories like this. Athletes stepping out of a parent's shadow, business heirs choosing a different path, political families divided by vision, and religious ministries are no different. At some point, every new generation faces the same challenge. Do they preserve the path they inherited, or do they build something new? For Jonathan, that question remains at the center of the story, not because he has all the answers, but because people are still trying to understand where his journey leads next. Will he remain a rising voice within the world that shaped him? Will he help influence the future direction of Lakewood Church? Or will he eventually carve out an entirely separate path of his own? No one knows, and that uncertainty is exactly why the conversation refuses to disappear. Because beneath every debate, every viral clip, and every headline sits a much larger question. Not whether Jonathan Osteen challenged expectations, not whether people agree with his message, but whether the next chapter of his story is only beginning. Because if the last few years have revealed anything, it's this. The future people once assumed for Jonathan Osteen is no longer guaranteed. And somewhere beyond the spotlight, beyond the speculation, and beyond the endless debate about legacy and change, a new chapter may already be unfolding. The question is, what happens when the son of one of the most influential pastors in the world decides that following in his father's footsteps is no longer enough? And if that moment ever comes, everything people think they know about the future of Lakewood Church could change overnight.